Hey guys, welcome to yet another episode of Scratchpad Sessions with me, Harsh. And today we have someone with us who is not mainstream, yet is involved in the poetry scene. She's someone who writes with impact and she gracefully offers with her words. We have none other than Ankita Shah. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
I think it's an honor for me to be sitting here because I have, like we were discussing before this, I have seen you in very few shows or open shows or very, very less open mics. But I have been blown every single time I've seen you on stage because it's just, I mean, how do you do this? It's just, it's so impactful. It's so raw in a sense that I can exactly feel what you're feeling without me having to be in your place. And I think as writers and creators, I think that's something that we try to achieve, that people feel something that we felt at some point. And I think for me, you've done that all with every single time I've seen you on stage. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for being here. Let's begin with all the basics of what is writing to you?
Writing has always been a way to navigate what I was feeling, what I am feeling. It has been a way to understand the complexities of life, of just everyday, situations. And I think I've always been a bit of an introvert, so it's been very important for me to, or it's been more natural for me to understand and express myself through writing. It's been the only way I felt like I was communicating everything honestly and with clarity. So that's what writing has been in all forms, not just poetry, whether it's writing emails to friends or even in my professional writing, I try to incorporate those aspects. I mean, you don't have to try, but it kind of it just reflects the same sort of thinking. Yeah.
And you mentioned about writing emails. So I'm assuming this began a long time back. And when did you actually realize that, oh, you could just write more than writing like essays or something in school?
Right. So fortunately, I've been very privileged to have teachers in school who really encouraged writing and speaking and elocution and debates and all sorts of things. And of course also having parents who thought that it was okay to participate in these things while I was studying and managing all of that. So school was an important phase in life where I got to I wrote a lot of essays. I got to participate in competitions where I had to speak. So there is a certain training, a very subconscious training that I kind of carry with myself. I used to give annual speeches in school. So there is a sense of what, when I read on stage, I kind of carry that, those values and those ideas of, what do you do when you're reading a poem? How do you read it? How do you enunciate? Where do you look? And all of those little aspects. Writing also sort of began when I was in school. I wrote my first few poems in school. But yes, eventually, I think it was towards the end of college that I felt like this was going somewhere. This was not just, I mean, I think throughout your phase as a writer, I feel you're constantly criticizing yourself and your writing and your work, which continues, right? I think for all of us, we have that because we know ourselves the most. And so having said that, I mean, I still criticize what I write. I still have doubts about what I'm writing, what I'm creating. Having said that, it was probably in the last year of college that I was posting a lot of my writing on a blog. That was the blog generation blog phase
Everyone has a
of
blog
the
phase.
internet. Yeah. And I was posting some of my writings there, and I was sharing it with a few of my friends, and I think it was partly personal and partly external validation that kind of makes you realize that, okay, this is
Maybe, yeah.
this is something that you do want to pursue. And yet writing has been something that I felt like this was one of the most important ways I felt I could talk about what I had to talk about. So it was almost also impossible to do it in any other way. So there had to be something more that I wanted to
Convey,
carry it on in life. Yeah.
And you mentioned school. So where did you study and
I studied in a school in Veera Desai. It's called Swami Muktanand High School. It was a state board school, and I think it was the teachers over there that really allowed and encouraged all of us. I have a group of friends who all of us were in drawings, in music. I was in music. I was in drawing. I was not in sports, but everything else. I was encouraged to participate. And interestingly, the first poem I wrote I was also part of this nature club, which is this.
Yeah.
I believe, like
I
most
think
of
many
us,
schools had
many
that.
schools had where they asked us to do, like, we had walks and
Environment.
visits to the park, and be more sensitive towards the environment. And my teacher, this particular teacher, told me one day to watch this news show. And on that particular day, they were going to cover a story about endangered olive ridley turtles. And she said, this was, I think, when I was 12 or 13 years old. And she said, why don't you watch it tonight? It's going to come on TV at 7. And write something in response to that. Write something in response to what you see and what you hear. And that's how I wrote, I think, my first poem. And it was about endangered olive ridley turtles. It rhymed a lot.
Wow.
And it ended with probably something along the lines of, save the earth and save animals. And she really liked it. and she said that we should get it published in a magazine, one of those wildlife magazines. So we sent it, and it got published actually.
Yeah.
And then I think I somewhere have that cut out. So
Oh wow.
that is how teachers really shape you,
Impact,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So I think it was her encouragement and her belief that I could do this, that I probably even carried it on in life generally.
That's really nice. Do you remember the whole piece? And can you?
I think I will
Besides some
not
lines,
say.
no.
I have forgotten all of it.
Okay. Or the magazine, what is it called? Anything
The
that we
magazine
can
is
go
the
look up?
World Wildlife Fund magazine, which is
Okay.
WWF, the organization.
Yeah.
They used to have a local magazine. I don't think it's like it's a national edition or anything. I think it was a Bombay edition or something of that sort. So I'm sure
so
it
we
was
can't find it
definitely not
anywhere.
that. Yeah, I don't think you can.
So we'll have to contact you again and figure out what was it. It sounds like an interesting piece. Like you can't imagine at the age of 13 you would write something. Like if you didn't have the source, if you didn't see something like that.
So I think it's so relative in the sense that it's relative to people who, us who grew up a certain way. I have seen 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds write, and seen and heard and read great poetry, which I could have never imagined that at that age I could manage, right? So I remember in Goa, there was this program and there was a young girl, who read beautiful poetry. And it was unimaginable that she was the age she was. But I think it really depends a lot on the kind of reading that you're doing at what age, and, and reading and writing, how used to you are with expressing yourself in words, and what is the vocabulary that you're building at that age. I think a lot of it, vocabulary, not just in terms of hard words, but vocabulary in terms of the kind of work that you're also reading and the kind of thoughts, the kind of values that you're letting in at that age. I think a lot of it depends on that. So, yeah, it is. When I look back, that is really shitty poetry, but I have seen people of that age right now writing brilliant work. And even you would know that at open mics we have like 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds coming and reading.
16,
I don't think I at least wrote. So I think we all have had our own journeys.
Yeah.
Just to kind of sum it up, like we all have our own journeys, and we all started writing in a very, very something that we would be embarrassed to show
Yeah, it is.
to people.
I can't.
And
None of my.
I think it just reflects the fact that we are growing as people and growing as writers, and I think that's the positive side.
Yeah,
of
I
it.
think if you look back in time and if you see the pieces, then you would know that you have come a long way. I mean, it is going to be embarrassing, or you will look at it as,
Yeah.
wow, why
Yeah.
would I write that? It's
Yeah.
so bad. But I think for that age, how sensible you are, you could write the best you could.
Exactly.
And like obviously now when you write about something, it's going to be way different than if I go back to what I wrote when I was 10, it's obviously going to be really bad with everything, not just the content, the grammar or the words I used or
Yeah.
anything else.
Yeah.
But right now it's different. But I think it's good to go back and see. And again, like you mentioned, I don't think we're ever going to stop criticizing ourselves because, I mean, until that's going to help us grow. We're not going to stop.
Yeah.
Because if we stop, then I think we'll be done the day we're
Yeah.
satisfied with whatever we've written. I'm very scared. I mean, the day you're satisfied, you're done. You're like, okay, I don't need to express.
I think I experience satisfaction only at the end of a poem. At the end of the process. Of writing or finishing a poem,
Yeah.
yes, there is a beautiful feeling that I think all of us experience at that point in time. But then you move on, and then you're like, okay. Then there's a phase of what next, and then you're constantly reading better stuff
So
out
that-
there, and then you're like, I don't think I'm done yet.
And also when you write something that that you've reached beyond what you planned on, and you're really happy with what you've written, and then you're done, and then like now I have to beat that. Now you have to go
Yeah.
and do something
Yeah,
better
better.
than that.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a little scary, but it's very challenging and fun in a way. Because you're like, oh, now there's something more to explore and more to
Absolutely.
learn. And there's so much more to learn. I don't think you'll ever stop learning from text, from people, from just experience or listening to it. And I think that makes a huge difference. You mentioned your teachers. I'm assuming they are one of your inspirations to
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Who has been your inspiration throughout, or someone who you've been reading, or someone in your life otherwise who's been there with you throughout this whole journey that you
Of writing.
Of writing, yeah.
I think it's hard to pick one person. There's been like at different points in time, there have been different people who've supported and who've encouraged this. Starting from my teacher in school to my friend in college with whom I started the poetry club, Trupti. She's been a constant support, not just for my own writing, but just generally helping me I mean, we've helped each other understand what it means to read and practice and criticize poetry of our own and each other. I think that's what we try to do with the poetry club also. That has been a big, big factor to my own writing process. And then, of course, my mother and my father, both of them have been extremely supportive of poetry in general, and you know, the idea of every weekend I would be out because, I mean, I have a day job, but then every weekend I'm out because I have programs, or I have poetry sessions, and they would never understand. Yes, there was a period where they would never understand that why am I doing this, and what is it in what's in it for me, right? Like that's what parents ask you. What are you getting out of it? So it was very difficult, but I think they've been very, very supportive throughout. So I think all of these different factors, and then of course there are writers that you read.
Yeah.
Who are your inspirations. I started, I think my first Indian writer that I was greatly influenced by was Arundhati Subramaniam. That was sometime in 2012 or 2013 when I was volunteering with Tata Literature Live that I heard her. And I heard her speak, I heard her read her poems so beautifully and talk about her poems, that I immediately went and bought her book and then read. And then after that, I've been sort of recommending her to everybody else I meet and have met. So she's been a great, great influence because not just her poetry, but conversations with her have been so enriching. You know, it's been enriching, and it's made us understand, and I say us because she's influenced not just me, but a lot of writers in current contemporary, you know, young writers in this scene. And she's made us understand why poetry is not just something that we do on the side, or we do, I mean, of course we do that on the side, we do multiple other things in life, but the kind of seriousness with which, when we sit down to read or write poetry, the kind of seriousness we need to put into that, the kind of hard work that goes into it, is immense, and that's needed. That kind of commitment to language, that kind of commitment to writing is needed to be able to write good poetry. So I think she's been one of the greatest inspirations.
Now you spoke about, I want to talk to you about two different things, but first we'll talk about the Poetry Club, because I think that's, how long has that been into play, and what exactly does it do, and how do you like manage? You, if I'm not wrong, you guys have events like, I think you used to have once in a month at one point.
Yeah.
And please tell us more about how this came about and what exactly does it do.
So Poetry Club started when we both, Trupti and I, both graduated from college, and we both studied commerce. We both studied to become chartered accountants. We both are chartered accountants.
Oh.
So our environment in college and our company of friends was, of course, mostly people who are very, very focused, and they have this one agenda. All of us did, I think, so Trupti and I as well, that we have to clear this exam, and then some of them wanted, to be rankers, because then basically your future is like better, right, if you get a rank in the exam. But fortunately, there were few avenues in college. I studied from NM. Okay. So there were few avenues in college. Say the Cultural Fest, or there were Rotary Club, there were other groups, Debating Literary Society, that we revived, which was defunct for many, many years. So there were these few avenues where we could, pursue our interest in writing, in literature. And through that, we met people who came from similar interests. And Trupti and I shared love for reading. So that's how we got introduced with each other, and we spoke a lot about the kind of books we were reading, what we liked, what we didn't, all of that. And when we left college, when we graduated, after that we had no such, not even that, we were left with nothing, no other group or no other community to go back to. And I think that's when we discovered that we both wrote poetry. Until then, we didn't know that we also wrote poetry. And we just had a conversation that let's do something, let's reach out to other people who also write, and let's create a sort of group where we could meet and share and give each other feedback. So feedback was the most important thing for us when we started out with TPC, that was the most important objective for us. Mainly because there were, as I said, we are constantly criticizing, and we are looking at our work with a critical eye throughout, right? It kind of worsens when you come from a background academically that's not trained you in literature, that's not given you enough exposure in literature. You're even more self-conscious, and I would say underconfident about what you're creating. Which is, I think, at least was true for me. I won't say that for Trupti. But it was at least true for me. And I think having a community that we could go back to, which wrote, which had some sort of experience in writing and reading, and receiving and giving each other feedback on our work, was something that we wanted to be able to do with TPC. So we started with one session a month, and because it was supposed to be entirely free and accessible to everybody who's interested, we started with our sessions in parks and open spaces, places where we didn't have to shell any money, and neither did we want people to. So it was completely informal in that sense. And when word grew, we got invited to different venues to do our sessions. So we moved almost every 2 to 3 months. We were moving to different venues, cafes or art spaces and stuff like that, to do these sessions. And we've, I think, for the last, this began in 2013. I think last year we took a break because a lot of us who started TPC and got involved early on moved on to different cities, different jobs, and it was very difficult for us to sustain the sessions. But we resumed, I think, last month. And apart from the sessions, which, as I said, were mainly focused on feedback and conversation around poetry, we managed to do a lot of other public performances because I think people started looking at TPC as also a collective of poets in a way. So we used to get a lot of proposals to, for us to go and go to different places to perform for audiences or to conduct workshops and stuff like that. And I'm very proud of a few of our friends who've managed to, quit their day jobs and get into writing assignments because of TPC, because of the assignments that we got at that point in time. So there were all sorts of different, you could say, outcomes and avenues that opened, right, with TPC. And I think it's the most important thing that TPC did for all of us, I would say, is that it opened us to the whole treasure trove of poetry that was being written in Bombay. When we started, we thought it would be just 7-8 of us who were in college, who were in those literary societies or whatever that we'll end up seeing. What happened in 2 or 3 sessions was that we had writers. TPC was the first avenue for me to get introduced to Hindustani and Urdu poetry, and I think almost every session we had 50 to 60% of writers who wrote in Hindustani and Urdu, and then a few in Marathi, a few in Gujarati, and then of course majorly in English. But the kind of writing that I didn't know existed
in the city,
and in the city, that was beautiful. And I remember there was this particular session in Bandra. That place doesn't exist anymore, but it was a cafe, and that was the first session where we had almost 50 or 60 people who ended up attending. And our usual cap was 20-25 because that's how much you must have for a conversation. Otherwise, you cannot. So we ended up having 50 or 60 odd people, and this was fairly in the beginning of our journey. So it was very, very surprising. And I remember both Trupti and I were like crying, literally crying with tears in eyes. And we had no idea that this something so simple, something so small could impact and could bring so many people together. So yes, it has opened so many avenues, conversations with so many poets, friendships with so many poets, and more importantly, those friendships led to finding peers who we could share our work with, even outside of those sessions, right? That's how you develop your critics network or a peer network, the circle that you know that if I say this person is going to give me honest feedback,
no matter what,
and something that's constructive. It's not just something to put you down. And that was something that we, from the beginning, from early on, we decided would be one of the rules in the session, that we had to be very, very kind when we were sharing feedback with each other, because we didn't want. A lot of the people who turned up for the sessions were people who just begun writing, and we didn't want to stop them. We didn't want to end their interest in writing. That was not the idea of criticism, or that was not the model, or that was not the objective. So Trupti and I, and then of course later a lot of other people who became core members of the group, our job or our responsibility in those sessions was to moderate those sessions in a way that we made sure that everybody was sharing what they felt about the poem being read, but also being very, very honest and kind and empathetic towards the other person. And we tried to, make sure that people were not getting personal, people were not getting very, not
diplomatic or political,
but also not contesting someone's political ideology, because that conversation was unending, and that was not what the sessions were meant for. Of course, those are important conversations, but the sessions were meant for more for the critique of the writing, for critique of the technique, for the performance, for the reading, for the format, for the style. It was not meant to argue on, where you stand on your political spectrum, right? Yeah. So that was very important for us to also keep in mind as moderators.
But the fact that this whole process involved anything with honesty and kindness and empathy was, I think, a brilliant idea, because I think it's needed, because we don't look at ourselves the same way we I mean, when someone else is giving us feedback, we do listen to it. But when we are self-critiquing, it's sometimes goes on to, the playing the underconfident card of, I'm not good at this. Or like, and it's very easy to say that.
Yeah.
So I think when, also when your surroundings are the same and you're getting feedback in a way which is very kind, you start listening to it, you start focusing on it. Somewhere subconscious, you develop a sense of doing that for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think it's brilliant because I don't think so far I've not met a group of people who used to just sit, critique, and also be kind and empathetic at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think we're somewhere missing it right now. And I hope that we do come back to that point where conversations begin, dialogues between people about honest feedback, because eventually everyone's going to grow out of this and everyone's going to grow out of the scene. So it's a great initiative, and I'm so glad you guys started back.
Yes.
I'm hoping to attend it soon. Take us through a journey of your favorite authors, and who you're reading right now.
So Arundhati, I mentioned earlier, is another book that I keep going back to. This is her book. The cover is missing, but this is When God is a Traveler.
Okay.
And what I like about Arundhati's writing is her very, very thoughtful use of words and language generally, even in her general communication, but more so when she is writing her poems. And the use of very, very strong metaphors and images. Very strong, very different. And I think in every poem you're unlayering. There are so many different symbols and images that she's constantly using. So she is a great, great inspiration. And I was fortunate that I was introduced to her writing when I started out. And I still recommend it to everybody who hasn't read a lot of Indian English poetry and is kind of looking, okay, where do I start? So she is one of the great writers currently. And then I keep going back to this book, which is called Slow Startle. This is by Rohan Chetri. And see, the book is essentially, if you read every poem, there is some sort of a death. Okay, the death of person, death of a memory, death of someone unrelated, someone who is a stranger, and so on. And I think what I like about his writing is the fact that it's extremely quiet in expressing, something that's deep and something that's full of grief, something that's yet something that's extraordinary in those little moments. And the poems, when you read the way they are described, the way the situation or the surrounding is described, is also very simple and quiet, and you almost don't know what's coming your way, and I think that's the kind of poetry that I'm drawn to more recently. Poetry that does not scream, poetry that does not ask for attention, but just lets you in slowly and then tells you what it has to say. And then, of course, moves you, because I think we all love poems that move us. That's what makes us go back to them again and again. Yeah. So that's another book that I keep going back to. I also feel with Rohan, I have a different connection, which is that I feel when I read his poetry that this is my voice. I think we all often feel that with certain poets I think I would have written this poem.
Exactly.
Or this sounds like me, or this sounds like something I would have written, or I would want to write. I think it's somewhere between I would have written and I would want to write. So that's how I also relate to Rohan's writing. And then there's Ranjit. Ranjit Hoskote is another very, very, very eminent poet from Bombay, and an art critic, and someone, again, who I look up to, with whom I've had some really, really interesting conversations about writing and about poetry. So these are a few writers that I go back to. Currently, I am not reading anything in poetry. Yesterday I started reading Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy.
Okay.
Which is sadly something I haven't read all this while. I'm getting introduced to it at this age. But it's okay. So
I've still not read it, and I've heard enough from people about how much I should have read it at some point, and I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't have enough people to tell me I should. I've just got introduced to it right now, and it's fair.
Yeah.
I think any book I think also once had a roommate who used to read a lot, and he just told me one thing, that a book will you'll reach out to a book, or a book will reach out to you when there is a certain time to it, and I really believed in it, because I've really not read a lot, and when I started again, it just, whatever books I've read, it has all come very randomly to me from either people or places or something that just happened. So yeah, I mean, you should just let go of these people, because there'll always be someone who'll tell you, oh, you haven't read that, it's you losing out, and I'm like, okay, that's fine, we'll figure it out. But that's really nice.
So I think my inspiration in reading comes partly from, of course, poetry, reading other people's writing, other people's poetry. But also from, I mean, we all read stories. I think stories are something that we keep going back to, and something that holds me more than non-fiction. Non-fiction, I'm very specific and particular about what I read. But novels, short stories, and poetry, something that I like to carry when I'm traveling, like to carry when I'm even like locally, moving in the train or bus or whatever. So those are little spots in the day that I try to find to read.
Coming back to writing, do you discipline yourself to write every single day? Do you believe in that you should be writing every single day?
I do believe in it, but I don't end up keeping up with that. I definitely believe that there has to be discipline to write almost every day. But it's very, very difficult to actually get down to do it.
Yeah.
At least I'm speaking for myself. I'm sure a lot of people manage to do it, but it's difficult, especially if there's tons of other things that are constantly on your mind, and you're trying to finish. Even after you come home, you're trying to finish something, probably from work. You're carried forward it from work, or some other project that you're working on. And oftentimes poetry, because we do it for ourselves, we kind of take it for granted.
For granted, yeah.
Right? Because
Definitely.
nobody is really following up with us that, hey, did you?
Yeah.
We wish, but I nobody's following up with me that, hey, I haven't heard your latest piece. Where is it? When is it coming out?
True.
So,
I've thought about this so many times.
But it's also a privilege, right? It's also a privilege that nobody is, I mean, we're not answerable to anybody. So it means that there is a certain honesty that we can write our pieces with. Like, we don't have to live up to, I mean, of course, if we create if we start believing that, we fall into that trap, yes, there is a lot of expectations we need to keep up to. But those of us who have the privilege of not doing that, I think yes, it's a disadvantage that yes, you can't it's difficult to be disciplined on your own. But what I do try and do is that I don't have a constant schedule or timetable that I will sit at this particular hour and write, but most of my writing has happened in transit. I think I speak for a lot of us who write in trains and buses and on the toilet seat, or
it's a great place.
So it's a great place.
Yeah, I think
so.
It's a great place.
I remember that there was I don't know which piece it was, but I remember that editing this particular piece, every time I went to the loo,
you could just figure out
I could just like go back to it and like read it and like, oh, this word is not working. Okay, this is not working. And then I'm done, and then I come out, and then I go back to it like a few hours later. And I think that's a good exercise.
It's a good
because I have learned that once you've written the piece, the first draft, of the piece, you need to keep it away for a while, and then go back to it, and then again leave it be, and then go back to it. So there's this sort of to and fro that you're constantly doing, because if you continuously sit with it, I think you will just massacre it. You won't really. It'll become something it didn't start out to be.
And somehow you convince yourself after writing I've done that at least. If I'm not written up to what I'm supposed to write, then I'm just convinced that this is all I can do. Because if I keep going back to it, I'm tired of looking at the same first ideas, and I'm like, this is it. I don't think.
So I think it's good to like leave it and then continue to do your daily work.
Yeah, come back
and then
to
come back to it when you find the time. And most of this time is usually when you're alone, when you're going somewhere, getting somewhere. So that's mainly been my process of writing. And then these sort of notes that I make when I'm traveling are not necessarily poetry, right? When we jot down these things or thoughts and
Yeah.
observations, we don't know what shape it's going to take. So I let that process be completely independent of, I don't want to force some sort of a metaphor, some sort of an idea here because, this is the shape I want it to take. So at that point in time, the first few drafts or the first few outpourings that we are doing have to be completely independent of what form it's going to take. Sometimes it may become a story, sometimes it may be a poem, sometimes it may end up as a Facebook post or an
Anything,
Instagram
you
post.
never
It's
know
a
what
vent. You're just venting out. You realize that you're just venting
It's
out.
not-
So
yeah,
it's
it's not
not a
poetry.
poem. So let it be and just post it on Instagram and get over with. So I think at that point in time, these are just notes. And then what is important for me and what has given me some of the best of my pieces is to go back to notes that I've written many, many months ago, many, many years ago, and see what I want to do with it and see what I feel about them. Where do I see I can take them? So I don't know if you've heard my poem Light Years. That piece
yeah.
came about after months of just notes. And these notes were not notes, again, with any intention. These were notes, just things that I
And
was
it's all
feeling.
random times you've written it, and
Random
it all
times.
came
And it all
together.
came together.
Wow.
And it
Yeah.
all came together because I was feeling something in that period of time, which was constant in those
The lines helped you fit exactly what you're trying to say.
Yeah, that's why it kind of fit together. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to put down what we are feeling at whatever times we can, if we are not able to follow a schedule, and put them in a place which is accessible, which you can go back to, and you can see stuff that you've written many months ago, many years ago, and see what you can do with that work. So that's been my process mainly. Yeah.
That sounds good. Did you ever think back in college? Let's go back in college and figure out when you felt like writing is something that you are able to do in a way that you're exactly able to express something. Did you ever think your writing was going to take you places?
No.
No.
Never.
So it was just something that you did out of blue.
Yeah, totally.
And it just happened.
Yeah, I think getting to places has become is a recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
It wasn't in 2012, 2013. It's more recently that poetry is helping people go places. I would say that with TPC, yes, we did go places because I remember it was a year or year and a half later, Trupti and I were invited to IIM Bangalore to do our first TED Talk, where we spoke about TPC, where we spoke about why we need art spaces and art communities of that kind to be able to nurture a community, that
Yeah.
really is valuing and appreciating poetry. So that was our first, I would say, program in another sort of space, another community where we were talking about our initiative and we were talking about poetry. And I think at that point we felt like, poetry is also a thing, and poetry can,
Develop
is
into-
interesting, and people find it interesting and whatever. So I think that was our first door of sorts. And then there were other programs, other people reached out to us, and that's when we started noticing that, yes, people, there is a way in which we can take poetry to the masses and to gatherings and spaces which are not used to poetry. So I remember we did a few Little Flea is the flea market that happens in BKC. So we consecutive 2 or 3 years we performed with them, and the kind of crowd that came there was completely caught off guard because they were not expecting poetry, right? But the response we got, the people stayed back till the end of the the show and heard everybody, and they were not there to listen to poetry. They were there to shop, most of them at least, or to listen
Just
to
to, yeah,
music, which
yeah.
was happening later probably that evening, and they just happened to be around and they heard, and they were curious enough and they stood there and they liked it. And I think that those are the kind of discoveries that are interesting,
Yeah.
because that's when you're kind of seeding something small in people, and that helps. I mean, that's the one side of that is it's building new audiences, but it's giving so much back to the poet, right? The poets. And these were poets that, as I said, like these were poets who we had discovered during TPC, that they were writing beautiful Hindustani Urdu poetry. People who were not from Bombay, who were from other parts of, mostly northern parts of India, who had been writing quietly, and suddenly they'd found a space where they were sharing these poems and people were appreciating
Yeah.
it, and there was this validation that was happening in that moment, right? So I think that was also great for the poets who were performing, and those were the times when we were also charging these organizations to pay the poets. So we had started these little, initiatives or little steps that we were taking to make sure that there was something going back to the poet, both in terms of tangible and intangible,
Yeah.
takeaways. And then there was also a new community, a new audience that was being built for poetry.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the similar thing about how how validation is as important. I mean, our criticism is as important as validation. Somewhere, I mean, as much as we deny it or not deny it, validation is important in a way, because it's some sort of acceptance. It's some form of someone telling you that, oh yeah, I listen to you, or
Yeah.
I do appreciate what you're doing, even though I don't kind of understand or feel, or I'm with you at this moment. And I think that's something that we all somewhere live for, in some sort of, it more than validation, it's just some sort of acceptance that I think is true. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think I similarly saw a very new wave when I started seeing a lot of events right here, just for poetry, and then I saw audiences come in numbers and just stay back and listen to it.
Yeah.
And then there were open mics where there were 40 performers, and about like the whole room is packed. And it was very nice to see that develop, where people are actually wanting to listen to more, wanting to consume more, wanting to express more. And I have seen days where I've seen similar audience, like similar people coming every Monday as audience, and then suddenly one day they're like, oh, let's try. I have something to say, because now finally it was so nice to see people joyfully just go up and do that. And it's nice because it takes me back to the time I started, because now it's so deep into it that sometimes when you're on stage, you forget that why you're on stage. Why did you ever happen to do this? And how much joy it gives you. And it's nice to look at them and be like, oh, this is why. Like that excitement was what got me there. It's very fascinating. What continues to intrigue you so much about writing?
I think what continues to intrigue me is the fact that we are never done saying what we have to say, and there's constantly new conflicts that we find ourselves in, new conflicts, new experiences, and also a new vocabulary that we're developing because of those experiences, right? We begin to understand the new meanings of a word or a concept because something has changed in our lives, and that change has affected what we understood of this concept. So I think writing for me, or the process of writing, continues to be intriguing because of that, because of the changing nature of language, where it's getting affected by my experiences, getting affected by how I see the world, and how that's also changing. And then, of course, as you read more, as you understand more of what's been written, what are the kind of ways you can write something, there's an attempt to explore that, explore different forms, different styles of writing. But there's also an attempt to see how can you bring that and something that's more contemporary together. Like I have been I have been very fascinated by how poetry and music can work together, or how poetry and dance work together.
Yeah.
So I think as writers or as artists, we are constantly also looking for ways in which we see this art form respond or interact with something else. And I think we're living in a time where all these boundaries, all these, categories are dissolving, right?
Yeah.
What we see or what we consume as art is put many different things put together, many different aspects, many different voices put together. And poetry is exciting because, yes, it's firstly a very, very personal process. Like what you write is so personal. Then you take it out to public and you're kind of reading or letting it reach out to strangers. So for me, the next most logical step is then how can I how can I take that poem to another artist or another person and see how they can respond to it, or how can I respond to their work. So that's something that I've been exploring and I've been wanting to explore a little more. So I think that's another way in which we grow as writers. I feel personally that it's obviously going to help me grow as a writer as well, because you kind of expand your ways of looking at poetry because of how the other person is looking at it, right? So there are different perspectives that come into it. So yeah.
I think that's again and the whole point of it. One is how to feel. I mean, what you feel the other person felt at some point, and also you develop this great sense of perspective that you can also, which helps you later, I think, in writing. When you're writing, you can also look at it at a different angle and be like, what if I actually went from here? It would sound so different. And yeah, that's also another very interesting part about it. And also, the next question I was going to ask you was, what does poetry mean to you? But I think you described it completely in this. Now let's go into a little more depth. Like you've already explained a little bit about Light Years, but I want you to take us through the journey of how Light Years was, or any other piece for that matter, a piece that you come about writing. How does the whole journey go about from ideating to the end editing? How just take us through the process.
So for me, I would say the most, like, if a poem's journey is this, like if I have to map it, or if I have to put a structure to it, if this is the size of the poem's life, of beginning conception to like where I feel okay, it's ready to be put out. I think this much is editing, and only this much is your initial conception, what you call introduction of the idea. You explore the idea a bit, and then you're kind of putting things out. Sometimes that exploration is not even there. You're not even aware of it, right? You're just like literally venting things out. You're just literally letting things out, what you feel in that moment or what you have to say. And I think when that's done, what we were discussing earlier, is that you step out and then you go back to it, and then all of the rest of the 70% to 80% of your time is just spent in understanding how you want to express the story now to someone else. Because there's one aspect of the first writing, which is that you're almost what I started out with. What is writing to me? I think like your initial process is literally for yourself. It's giving you clarity. It's giving you an understanding of what you feel. It's reflecting your confusions, your conflicts, your feelings at that point in time. So Light Years for me was most of the 6 to 8 months that I was just constantly putting things out, making notes about how I was feeling, was meant for me. That was not meant for someone else. It was me trying to understand why and what am I going through right now. And it's quite obvious, but I'm just putting it out there. The Light Years was about a breakup. It was about, the end of a relationship. So the next 6-8 months were spent just navigating those feelings. And that's what the notes initially were. And then I think I decided to go back to those notes and see what was coming out, see what was the theme that was coming out. And it was constantly about time. And time is a very, very interesting subject that I think I end up like going back to in a lot of my recent works also, because it connects with what I was telling earlier, that as we grow, as we live life, our understanding of concepts is constantly changing because of our experiences. So yes,
Yeah.
a breakup made me look at time in a different way. And then I lost my father. And then it made me look at time and memory in a completely different way.
Yeah.
So the poems that I wrote in that phase were about time, but yet they were a different perspective.
Yeah.
So that's what writing is doing to us, and language is doing to us, or we are doing to language, I would say. So Light Years was mostly then putting those things together and understanding the themes that were recurring. And then, I may not be going in the most chronological way of how things happen because I don't remember a lot of the process right now. But my idea would be that then I kind of put the things that were fitting together, that felt there was a thread to, these notes. And then I looked at this idea of time heals, and it's a very popular saying, right?
Yeah,
we
time.
often find ourselves saying it to our friends that it's okay, time will,
It's going to heal
it's going to
in
get
time.
better in time, or we've been said those things.
Yeah.
So this was the phrase that I wanted to respond to in the poem. And I wanted to question it. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to probably later also accept it. So the poem is a journey of understanding what happens next, and does it get better. And while you're understanding whether it gets better, you're also constantly fighting memories. You're fighting bad and good memories throughout, and you're understanding where to put what, now. So the poem was exploring all these different aspects. And another thing that I in that particular phase of my writing that I've seen come out more often is the symbols of space and nature. And I think I still do find a lot of those references even in the poems I'm writing right now. But this particular poem has references to the sky, to the stars. The whole idea of light years comes from the idea of space and time, and what how light travels and all of that. So those have been interesting things that I've constantly liked exploring in my poetry. So those are symbols that I decided I would use because it made most sense to how I wanted that poem to turn out. So yeah, so I think that's broadly, I would say, what Light Years was. And as I said, that a lot of the time that goes into after you kind of see the whole structure coming through is editing that and constantly editing that. And I think the editing does not stop ever, because every time you're performing it also,
you
are constantly
editing.
editing, and you're responding to how people are taking that poem. And in that process, you kind of sometimes discover that this word is not working, or this phrase is not working. Not because someone else is not receiving it well. I mean, of course, that's one way to say it, but you may not agree with that. But it's finally something that you should be convinced about. And yeah, so that process still continues. Every time I read, yes, of course, it's become less, less harsh to the poem. I don't change a lot. Maximum I will change is a word or a pause or a line break. Line breaks are something that I've constantly noticed that I spend a lot of time on, because I want to understand and I understand that it makes a lot of difference to an audience or a reader where I'm putting the pauses in my poems. And it helps as a writer to understand that when you're reading it aloud, not when you're writing it. When you're writing it, you don't as much, notice where the emphasis is where there's emphasis and where there isn't in your poetry. But when you're reading it aloud, every pause, every line break, every comma, every punctuation is adding something to the poem, adding weight or taking away weight from that line. So I think that's one thing that I end up spending a lot of time in. And of course, the language of the poem. The language has to fit not just my language or my vocabulary, but there's no harm in reaching out to a vocabulary that I feel I don't have yet, right? Which is looking for words that fit this poem more than the words I know. So that's another
that's all-
process that
that's-
we go through when we are editing a poem, that it should feel more natural to be used in this poem. If I'm talking about light years, if I'm talking about time, if I'm talking about heartbreak and love, what are the images and what are the words that I should, that fit most in my most natural, that also don't seem unnatural, or in, that I'm pretending to sound like someone else. They still do sound like
You,
me.
yeah.
But there is some thought that we end up putting in why we would say it in the way we say it.
Yeah.
So that's editing, again, the whole editing process for me.
And I do
Yeah.
believe that we all have a voice, and we have like a stage voice, and I feel like when the voice off stage and on stage come together is when, for me at least, that's my level of that I can. Then I'm able to reach out,
Yeah.
because then I'm actually saying what I want to say,
Yeah.
the way I want to say it, instead of having a stage persona and then
And a
off-stage,
different
then-
persona.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't think. I don't believe that really helps.
And that
Um,
doesn't last too long.
No, you know, like after a point you know that you don't talk like this or like off stage or something. So now again, you spoke about, like, let's say an 80% bit is your edit, right?
Yeah.
So take us through your circle. Do you edit mainly, or how is the process of editing generally works?
The process of editing is also partly like forgetting that you wrote that poem, right?
Which is very difficult.
Yeah.
So tell me how you do it. Because
You get into other things. You have to let it be for a while, and you do other things. You read more. You are working. You're working on another project, or you're just doing normal chores in the day. And I'm not saying that keep it like for months and just
Yeah.
forget it. I'm saying for a few hours, for a few days maybe. Don't rush with it. That's what I generally do. And then I keep going back to it in between. I'm doing other things to see what does it sound like, to look at it from a fresh eye every time, or a fresh ear every time. And one of the things that I always do when I'm writing a poem, when I'm editing a poem, is to read it aloud every time. When I've made a change in a line, I read the whole thing aloud again. And then if I make another change, I again read it aloud, because I feel poetry is so much about sound. It is of course about the words, it's of course about reading, but it's integrally, sound is so integral to what our experience of poetry is. And by sound, I not only mean the sound of the words, I not only mean the rhyme scheme that sometimes people use. I don't use them, but there's a certain rhythm to the way you've written something, and to the way it sounds to you, and you want it to sound to the audience or to the reader. That rhythm you will only know once you read it aloud yourself, and you'll know that, okay, this word is not working here because it's messing with the rhythm of this line, so you use something else. Or the sound of this word is too harsh for a poem which is not supposed to be harsh. You understand? Like,
Yeah.
if a poem is supposed to give you a view or an image or a feeling of something really happy and positive, then I won't use a harsh word there.
It changes the whole tone.
It changes the tone. So to a reader, to a listener, it'll suddenly be like, oh, what was that? What was that word? Why did? And sometimes we end up using a lot of prose words, words that we use in business communication,
Yeah.
or we use in text communication. I mean, text is still fine, but words that are very, very prose related, or come from the background of prose, that we end up using in a poem, which does not really justify its use. So the process of editing is all about looking at these tiny things, because they do end up making a lot of difference in how what your poem conveys to the reader. It's not finally just the meaning, right?
Yeah.
It's all about the experience of the poem, and the experience is all about how it falls on the person's ears, what they see, what are they visualizing when you're giving them the poem. Are there images in it? What kind of images are you giving them? Does it suit, or does it go with the kind of message you had to convey in the poem? So a lot of the editing process is about this, and I think I've answered. your question.
Hey guys, hi.
Hi, thank you for watching. This was Scratchpad Session. Make sure to like, share, subscribe to Why So Hush.
Thank you.